But as Andrew mentioned, my name is Dan Miller. I've been a parishioner at St. Peter and Paul since 1992. I'm a native of Burlington, Wisconsin. And recently I was appointed State Director of Pro-Life Wisconsin. I passed out my cards to most of you. If you didn't get one, I have plenty more. I'm here today because I believe it's my mission to help people understand why we need to end abortion in our lifetime. I believe the time is urgent. Why is it urgent? There are over 1 million babies that die every year in the United States. What does that come to? That's 2,767 babies every day, 115 every hour, 2 every minute. By the time I'm done with my talk, 40 babies will have died here in the United States. And yes, there are abortion facilities open on Sundays. Some are even open 24/7. Prior to my new position at Pro-Life Wisconsin, I spent 5 years, over 5,000 hours, praying and talking to young moms and dads about the dignity and the sanctity of life, their baby's life, in front of Wisconsin's largest second trimester abortion facility. For those of you who live in the neighborhood, you know exactly where I'm talking about. It's just less than a mile away from this church on Farwell Avenue. At that facility, over 2,500 babies die in Wisconsin every year. During that time, as a sidewalk counselor on Farwell, I spent 5,000 hours praying, talking to young moms and dads about keeping their babies. And during that time, we witnessed 620 moms who said yes to life. In the sidewalk counseling lingo, we call them saves. That baby was saved from abortion by something we said or by something we did to the young moms and dads. But I believe by far the hardest part about doing that work was witnessing over 10,000 young moms walk out after they had killed their child. They were broken not only physically, spiritually, and mentally. I don't believe that most of them truly understood what they were doing and the ripple effect it would have in their life. But today I'm here to talk to you about abortion, how it hurts women, and how it violates the dignity of the human person. Even if I wasn't Catholic, I could explain to you why abortion is clearly wrong and disordered based on natural law. A lot of times the pro-life movement gets accused of being too religious, that abortion is purely a religious issue. It is not. I have several friends who are in the pro-life movement who are actually atheists, who understand that if that is in fact true, that there is no God, this is the only chance they get. And to deny somebody that chance at life, the same chance that you and I got, would be unfair. So, based on natural law, it can be argued that abortion is wrong, as well as on religious grounds. We as Catholics are taught that there are some kinds of evil that are intrinsically evil. And abortion would be one of those evils. Here are some mind-blowing facts about abortion that you might have trouble wrapping your heads around. Since 1973 in the U.S., 1 in 3 women have had an abortion. Since 1973, since abortion became illegal in the United States, over 58 million lives have been lost to abortion. 74% of all abortions in the United States are performed on Christians. And for every 1 African American baby born in New York City, there is one aborted. It's a 50-50 ratio. If you're African American and in the womb in New York City, you have a 50-50 chance of being aborted versus anywhere else in the United States, you have a 1 in 3 chance of being aborted. We know that minorities are targeted by Planned Parenthood. This is shown by the virtue of the fact that 79% of all their facilities are in minority neighborhoods. So we know they're after that segment of the market. I mentioned before that I was from Burlington, Wisconsin. I knew that about 25, 30 years ago there was a Planned Parenthood in Lake Geneva. I thought it was strange that there was a Planned Parenthood out in that neck of the woods. But if you look at the demographic changes that have happened in Walworth County over the last couple of years, it explains why they moved to Delavan. Because the Hispanics moved to Delavan. Roughly half of all the occupants, all the citizens in Delavan are now Hispanic. They're following it. They're targeting it. And here's one you probably never saw coming. Catholics are the single largest denomination to receive abortions, 27%. But with religion aside, science is very clear on fetal human development. And here are some scientific facts that show that abortion violates that human dignity. Science has proven something that we have known as Catholics for over 2,000 years. Life begins at conception. We have the Immaculate Conception. We have Jesus' birth. He was the Word made flesh. It's not a foreign concept to us as Christians or Catholics, that life does begin at conception. Christ did not become the King of the universe at his birth. The Word was made flesh at that very moment of conception. A misnomer propagated by the abortion industry that the baby is just a blob of tissue. Well, did you know that that blob of tissue has a beating heart at 21 days? That's 3 weeks, just 3 weeks. All our organs are in place by the 28th day and the 4th week, and they are fully formed by the 84th day at 12 weeks. So all systems are in place and operating and functioning by 12 weeks. Science has also proven that babies are able to feel pain as early as 12 weeks. This makes sense, since all the organs are functioning and in place by 12 weeks. This was first noted in the short ultrasound video clip by abortionist Dr. Bernard Nathanson after his conversion to the pro-life movement. The movie was called The Silent Scream. It was a video of an ultrasound-guided abortion where it showed the abortion process. And as soon as the cannula was inserted inside the cervix, and it was poking around to find the baby repelled from the sharp instrument. And then ultimately the video showed the baby just screaming in the womb. And that's what did it for him. He turned away from the abortion industry after 30,000 abortions. And he was also the founder of the National Abortion Rights Action League. At 24 weeks, the baby kicks, moves, and can turn from side to side. The baby at that point can also hear the mother's voice. That's why you see some moms, it's very popular these days to put a boombox or put some sort of speaker next to the womb at that point in time. The baby will react to that, and the baby reacts to their mother's voice. The baby's also been witnessed sucking their thumbs in utero with the science of ultrasound machines. We know that the babies dream. We can see rapid eye movement in the baby in the womb. Their fingerprints and toe prints are formed at that time. And here's something I learned recently. The baby's blood circulates in the exact opposite direction as the mother's. Common question is why? It's because of the physics of hydraulic dynamics. In order for the baby to get nutrients from the umbilical cord, the baby's blood has to travel in the exact opposite direction as yours and mine. And the cool part, I think, is the God part. The minute the baby is born, there's a flap on your heart. As soon as the baby's born and breathes their first breath, that flap closes to the other side of the heart, and the heart begins circulating the blood in the same exact direction as yours and mine. Why would that be? Why wouldn't it be good enough to go the opposite direction? It's because of science. So that the baby is able to retrieve the oxygen from the lungs and supply it to the rest of the body. And that's only possible in one direction. The Catholic Church says that abortion should not be allowed without exception, even in the cases of rape, incest, or life or health of the mother. We do acknowledge that every person has the right to defend their own lives. If the mother has cancer, for example, she is fine. She's completely okay with defending her own life and treating the cancer. If the baby dies as a secondary effect, that is not an abortion. But in the case of St. Gianna Molla, we've seen that she in fact did make that choice to not receive the cancer treatment. Her baby lived, she died, but her daughter attended her beatification in Rome. The concept of exceptions for rape, incest, and life and health of the mother sounds terrible and sometimes insensitive at the first glance, but again, science has come to such a place where even in cases where the mother is getting a heart transplant or a kidney transplant, we've seen cases where the life of the baby was never in jeopardy during these operations. Science has come to such a level now that over 900 physicians worldwide who signed the Dublin Declaration stating that they can conceive of no possible situation where the mother's life would be in jeopardy as such to kill the baby. You have two patients all the time. And of course, the baby is not guilty. The baby conceived in rape is not to be punished with the sins of the father. The baby is always innocent. If any of you have an iPad or a cell phone of some sort, you can thank Steve Jobs for that. He was adopted. I don't know whether or not his mother was going to abort him. He was born in 1955, but that would not preclude his mother from getting an abortion here in the United States. They still occurred. A quote from Steve Jobs, I wanted to meet her, my mother, mostly to see if she was okay and to thank her because I'm glad I didn't end up as an abortion, he said. She was 23 and went through a lot to have me. Another widely known figure in the operatic world, Andrea Bocelli. He's a famous Italian tenor, singer. He says, quote, because of my personal convictions as a devout Catholic, I am not only fighting against something, I'm fighting for something. I am for life, end quote. He recounted how doctors had tried to convince his mother to abort him after she suffered an attack of appendicitis. And doctors said that the child would be born with a disability. I guess they were right on that. He was born blind, but he certainly can't sing. And that doesn't make him any less valuable or less dignified in the human race because he cannot see. Rebecca Kissling, a national spokesperson for Save the One, was conceived in rape. Her mother tried to abort her 3 times. She is now an attorney fighting to keep rape exceptions out of pro-life laws. Ryan Bomberger, He was the founder of the Radiance Foundation. He does a lot of work in the African American community, raising awareness about the fact that minorities are targeted by the abortion industry. And Ryan was conceived and raped and placed for adoption. We know that abortion hurts women. I know this because of something that happened to me in my work, my pro-life work on Farwell. I was friended by a young woman on Facebook. She never liked or commented on any of my posts, but after about 7 or 8 months, she inboxed me and told me that she was considering suicide. I asked her why. She said, I had 2 abortions in my past. I said, did you receive counseling? Did you go to your priest, your pastor, some sort of way to get forgiveness? She said, I did all that, but I couldn't forgive myself. I prayed a lot with her during that conversation on Facebook, but somehow she was attracted to the work that we did by what we put out there on Facebook. She reached out to me on Facebook, and she is alive today because of Facebook. She told me later on in that conversation, after we prayed, and I told her that you have 2 children who are in this world, they need you. Those are your 2 best reasons to not commit suicide. And of course, suicide would be a grave offense to God as well. And she said, Dan, I just want you to know you saved 1 more life today. All through Facebook. We know abortion hurts women. I've seen personally 10 ambulances stop at affiliated medical services on Farwell since August 3rd, 2010. As a Catholic Church, we know abortion hurts women. That is why Archbishop Weekland, in his infinite wisdom, made possible Project Rachel, which was started here in Milwaukee by Vicki Thorne. If you've never heard Vicki Thorne speak, you got to go. Yeah, you have to see her. She travels all throughout the world speaking on this issue. It is such a successful project that every diocese in the entire nation has adopted Project Rachel as a post-abortive healing ministry for men and women. Finally, one of the personal reasons I'm pro-life is we always knew that my mom or my grandmother and grandfather conceived my dad outside of marriage. There's only 6 months between his birth certificate and their marriage certificate. We grew up knowing this, and we were just happy that they did the right thing. They got married, raised my dad, and then had I have an uncle because of it and many cousins. But something I found out on September 3rd, 2014, from my sister Debbie, was that getting married was not plan A for my grandparents. This was in 1934. Young, practicing Catholics, maybe not practicing hard enough, but they found themselves pregnant outside of marriage. Their family physician referred them to a doctor in Sheboygan who would perform an abortion on my father. They actually went. It wasn't just a fleeting thought. I asked my sister, because I'm a sidewalk counselor, I was very interested in knowing what turned them around. And they said they were afraid of getting caught by the civil authorities. So these are 2 practicing Catholics who were more afraid of the civil penalties than they were of, God's law. I don't blame them for that, but I'm just happy that the law was in place that saved my father from abortion and consequently my own life. So you could say it's in my genes to be against this. I would not be here today if it were not for that law. I'm coming up on my 20 minutes, but I have one more story I'd like to share with you. It's about something that happened on Farwell Avenue in my sidewalk counseling career. I was trying to illustrate to this young man the importance of his son or daughter's life, and I was very unsuccessful in doing so. I tried 3 times, and thank God he was a smoker. He came out for the 4th time, and I was like, God, you got to help me here. I've already talked to him 3 times, and I don't know what else to say to him. What more can I say to him? And so I said a quick prayer to the Holy Spirit and went to talk to him again. I said, I want to make a deal with you. He said, what's that? He said, I want to trade my life for your son or daughter. He said, what do you mean? Trade your life. And I said, when your son or daughter is born, you can take me out into the middle of that street, you put a gun to my head, and you pull the trigger. And he said, Dan, that's crazy. I would never do that. And I said, exactly. In God's eyes, your child and my life, your child's life and my life are equal in value. Now go inside, take her by the hand, get her out of there. And they did, and that child's life was spared. My wife was here tonight. I came home to tell her that story, and she said, Miller, you never do that again. But I did it 5 more times, and 5 more babies were saved because of it. And nobody's taken me up on it, obviously. And I pray they don't. I guess no talk about abortion is complete without a quote from Blessed Mother Teresa. Abortion kills twice. It kills the body of the baby, and it kills the conscience of the mother. Abortion is profoundly anti-woman. 3/4 of its victims are women. Half of the babies, and all of the mothers. We know that God loves us without exception. We need to reflect that in our laws. And we must love our preborn brothers and sisters in Christ without exception, unconditionally, as Jesus did. So that is the end of what I have for you tonight. I want to thank you so much for your attention. I believe Gary is going to speak next. If you have any questions after the show, we'll be here. Thank you.
Don't let the collar fool you. I'm not a priest, I'm a deacon. I'm Deacon Gary Nosacek. I'm stationed at St. Peter and Paul. I've been a parishioner there for about 30 years now, I believe, maybe longer. Also a member of St. Robert's for about 20 years. And as my duties develop, I've been involved with Old St. Mary's. I've been here a couple of times. I've been at St. Rita's, so I'm kind of like a jack of all trades, or as my kids would say, a jerk of all trades. But you're probably wondering why I'm here, because Dan is obviously such an expert on the pro-life movement, being the head of Pro-Life Wisconsin. The next speaker is a doctor who deals with end-of-life issues, and they asked me to do the death penalty. And he'd probably say, well, why? Because he's got the little plastic collar, but no, that's not the reason. The reason is, and most of our parishioners don't know this, but I've had two friends who were murdered. Both of them were shot and killed. So the death penalty is not just something that we learn in catechism class to me. It's not just something that the church has talked about. It's something that I've had to deal with on a very personal level. When Andrew asked me to talk about it, I didn't realize it was going to become the hottest topic in the world right now because, first of all, on April 20th, there was a talk on the International Symposium for the Death Penalty, and the Pope published a letter, which I think you all got copies of when you came in. And that was just April 20th, and he reaffirmed everything that the church stands for. So my talk, the catechism, years and years and years of writing, it's all in this letter. The same day, as fate would have it, or maybe as the Holy Spirit would have it, Dr. J. Chapman gave an in-depth interview to a number of press outlets, and he ended up arguing with himself during that interview about the pros and cons of the death penalty. And you're probably thinking, well, who's J. Chapman and why do we care what he thinks? Dr. J. Chapman is the man who invented the lethal injection, and now he's having some grave, serious doubts about it, and I'll talk about that a little later. And then, of course, as you probably all know, just 48 hours ago, the verdict came in with the Boston Marathon bomber, and he was sentenced to death. So suddenly, something that was just going to be a little talk here has taken on this huge international debate. And I imagine tomorrow, when everybody's back in their offices, we're going to get things from the Vatican, we're going to get things from the Council of Bishops, we'll get things from Amnesty International, and it'll be interesting to see how that all shakes out. A little bit of background history before I talk about what the church has to say about the death penalty. I'm going to talk about one of the murders and show you how this all comes together. I'm just going to refer to him as D because I haven't talked to his family and I don't want to use his name without their permission. He was a guy I met the first year that I was at UWM. He was in the broadcast specialty along with me. I was a 30-year radio veteran before I went into the diaconate. We hung together for years and years. When we weren't in the classroom, we were at UWM together. We had a group of about 4 or 5 of us that hung together for all of our academic career. And then when we graduated, we both stayed in Milwaukee, and he worked at a TV station, and I was at various radio stations. Now, Dee was the kind of guy that every TV crew wanted, especially when they did public service things, because he would be the first one there, set up the camera, set up the sound, stay through the whole broadcast. He would work carefully with the charities and the organizations to make sure they had what they wanted. And then he'd stick around afterwards and make sure that everything was put away and that the charities and the organizations had what they needed. In fact, the day he was murdered, he was working on Toys for Tots. He had stuck around, he helped the Marines put all the toys away, and then on the way home he decided, well, I'm going to stop at a nightclub and visit some of my friends, have a few drinks, and then I'm going to go home. That decision to go to the nightclub is what killed him. I found out at the trial that the murderers had specifically targeted that nightclub. They had stalked it, and they were watching people go in and out, looking for the ideal victim. And when Dee came out, they said, that's the guy we want. He was picked specifically because he was gay and he was African American. They put a gun in his ribs, took him to his car, drove off to some secluded area, shot him, and then just to make sure, they rolled over him with his own car. When I was at that trial, and this was way before I put the collar on, way before I even thought about being a deacon, I knew in my heart of hearts, I knew in my mind, if there was a death penalty in Wisconsin, I would volunteer to flip that switch. I was that sure. I was that upset. I was that mad. Well, 6 months later, I had a chance to figuratively flip the switch. I guy who was running for office statewide in Wisconsin came to the house. He knew the story about his wife was had a brother who was a mutual friend of ours. So he thought if he could get me on board, I could go around telling the story, I could get the other broadcasters involved, and he could get his staunch law and order platform passed. You probably all know it by heart. You know, judges are too liberal, the sentences are a joke, the prisons are too cushy. Maybe if we took a couple lives instead of sentencing everybody to life, it would be a deterrent and we would make the point. And he was saying, you can help me do this. So I'm thinking, you know, is this the chance that I can be like a Batman? I can take this murder and I can become a Dark Knight, I can become an Avenger, I can become somebody who can get revenge for what happened to my friend Dean. But I knew that the Catholic Church said that the death penalty was wrong. I wasn't quite sure why, because at that point I wasn't really much more than a Sunday go-to-meeting Catholic. So I told him, well, you know, let me think about it. I'll get back to you about this, and I'll let you know if I'm on board with what you want to do. So I went to the Catechism, and I looked up paragraph 2266. And it says, the Church acknowledges as a well-founded right and duty of legitimate public authority to punish malefactors, that means bad guys, by means of penalties commensurate with the gravity of the crime, not excluding in cases of extreme gravity the death penalty. Now some people say, see, the Catholic Church is in favor, it does allow the death penalty. And I even saw, when I was researching this, people saying John Paul, Benedict, Francis, they're changing the doctrine. The Catholic Church says death penalty is okay. Well, that's not what it says. They're overlooking two very important words: extreme gravity. Now, while I was thinking about my friend Dennis and Dee and what they did to him, to my mind it was extreme. To my mind it was a very grave thing. But did it fit what the Church meant when it said extreme gravity? Well, let me give you an example of what the Church might mean when they say extreme gravity. If you're my age or older, you know about the Nuremberg trials. After World War II, because the crimes against humanity were so organized and so extreme and so cold and so calculated, the Allies held trials. They wanted to hold the people that did this accountable. And because those crimes were so extreme and so grave, and because there was a danger that the people who were being tried might get out of prison by supporters who might rise up and try to reinstate the Third Reich, the death penalty was given to a lot of those defendants that were found guilty of these crimes. But even in that case, not everybody got the death penalty. Rudolf Hess, who was one of Hitler's insiders, who was with him from the beginning, who was with him when the war started, who was with him as the war raged, but who went to England in 1943, and historians have kind of tried to figure out exactly why he went. They're still debating that. But he was put in prison. So after the war, there was a shadow of a doubt how much he knew about the concentration camps. And even if he did know, he wasn't involved because he was in a prison camp in England. So Hess was not given the death penalty, even in this extreme grave case. And the Catholic Church would say, yes, you were right. He was put in prison for life. In fact, he was the only prisoner in that prison for the whole time he was there. But just in case I could talk myself into thinking that my friend's murder was an extreme grave case that the Catechism would allow, the very next paragraph, 2267, says, if non-lethal means are sufficient, authority must limit itself to that. It is more in keeping with the common good, and it conforms to the dignity of the human person. So now I had to think, well, is a non-lethal means sufficient? Yes. The guy who pulled the trigger and drove the car got life without parole. He's isolated. He's gone. He's not going to do it again. He's not a threat to society. The other guy who went along for the ride, he got a very, very long sentence too. I honestly don't know if he's still in prison because this all happened back in the 1980s. But the non-lethal means were sufficient. And so I went back to the politician and I told him, no, I'm not on board with you. He was not happy because he really thought that he had an ace in the hole with me. In fact, his wife, who was the sister of a mutual friend of ours, never talked to me again. She died a few years ago. She went to her grave still holding that grudge because I would not endorse the death penalty. I would not endorse what they wanted to do using my friend's murder. But I continued studying it after that because I really wanted to know, what did the church have to say? And what did I think? Was it just stained glass window pieties that I only believed when I was in the church and then I just left it in the pew when I left? Or was it something that I could take with me into the world and use it every day? Well, John Paul was in St. Louis in 1999, and he said, "The dignity of human life must never be taken away, even in the case of someone who has done great evil. Modern society has the means to protect itself without definitively denying the criminal a chance to reform. So therefore, the death penalty is cruel and unnecessary." Did those guys do great evil? Oh yes, they did. Not only did they kill my friend, they destroyed his family. They hurt all of us. There'll always be a pain in our heart for not having him here. They certainly hurt the city because my friend had been involved in so many different causes and it had helped out with broadcasting so many different events, and now he's not there to help anymore. So yeah, these guys did great evil to a lot of different people. But, as the Pope said, you can't kill them. You've got to give them the chance to reform, and even if they don't, they still have the dignity of life. Andrew was very smart when he called this the seamless garment of life, because a lot of times when we think of life issues, we think of the unborn, and more we're going to be hearing about the end-of-life issues, especially from the physician-assisted suicide part of it. But we don't always think about what's going on in the middle when we talk about life. And this is a way to kind of sit back and say, yeah, there is a dignity to life, no matter what, no matter who. And I really enjoyed this comment from Cardinal McCarrick of Washington, D.C. He said, "How can you teach killing is wrong when we were going to go out and kill the person who killed? How do you teach killing is wrong by killing? It just doesn't make sense." And the other bishops, they kind of have issued documents on and off too, and I just will show you with a couple of things that they said. "The sanction of death when it is not necessary to protect society violates the respect for human life. State-sanctioned killing diminishes all of us. Its application is deeply flawed and irreversible. We have other ways to punish criminals." Amnesty International, of all people, has also issued a statement, and my learned colleague and friend Dan Miller is going to get a kick out of this because we know Amnesty International is no friend of the pro-life movement. They never met a law that tried to stop abortion that they didn't hate. They've filed grievances saying that blocking abortion is a crime against humanity. But when it comes to the death penalty, Amnesty International issued this statement: "It's the ultimate denial of human rights, it's premeditated, it's cold-blooded killing, and it violates the right to life." The right to life. Do you ever think you heard Amnesty International say there's a right to life?
There is a God.
Yeah, there is a God. But again, you know, that seamless garment. They don't realize that they're endorsing the seamless garment of life, but they are. Now, as far as Jay Chapman, I mentioned him earlier, the doctor that invented the lethal injection. He's really second-guessing this for a couple of different reasons. When the death penalty was re-allowed in 1977 by the U.S. Supreme Court, Gary Gilmore, a name some of you might recognize from the past, actually volunteered to be the first person to be executed under the new law. But the state did not want to make a spectacle of this that would create a lot of people protesting the death penalty. So they didn't want to do the electric chair, they didn't want to gas them, they didn't want to hang them, they didn't want to use the firing squad, all the things that they could use. So they went to Dr. Chapman, who was a pathologist who investigates a lot of crimes, and they said, come up with a humane way of executing prisoners. You know where he got the idea for the lethal injection? He went to vets in the Humane Society to see how they put down animals. Because he said we put down animals more humanely than we put down people. And that's where the lethal injection came from. Well, now, the drugs that he uses are from Europe. There's 3 of them that they used together to create the lethal injection. The Europeans have caught on to how we're using it, so they block the exportation of those drugs to the United States. Now lethal injections are kind of made up as they go, and they're not as effective as they used to be. They're not as safe as they used to be. In fact, the last prisoner that they executed, it took him 43 minutes to die because the drugs weren't working. So Chapman looked at that and said, no, this is not what I thought of when I invented this. So he's backtracking now, saying it's not safe anymore, it's not humane anymore. He doesn't endorse this anymore. But the other problem, he said, being a pathologist who's investigated crimes for over 50 years, is that there are things that he calls prosecutorial misconduct. In other words, people are more interested in getting a conviction than they are in getting the right guy. And a lot of times, they end up grabbing the wrong person. And the DNA evidence has released a lot of people who were found guilty beyond the shadow of a doubt by jury of their peers. Not only were they not guilty of the crime, it turns out in a lot of cases they weren't even there. So Chapman said, some ways I believe in the death penalty still, because he thinks from his history of investigating crimes, some people can never be rehabilitated and they don't have any redeeming features. In those cases, he's still leaning toward a death penalty. But more and more and more, he says, I'm leaning away from it because I see the misconduct that occurs. The problem is, I can't tell who's who anymore. So he would agree with the bishops in that a lot of times with these death penalties, we don't know if we've got the right guy. And so we can't use a death penalty because, as the bishops have said, sometimes we perpetuate the wrong people. It's not consistently used to against, well, it's not used across the board fairly, let's put it that way. There are more minorities, there are more poor people, there are people that don't have decent lawyers that get the death penalty more often than what I would consider suburbanites. One quote I saw, a defense attorney said, you'll never see O.J. Simpson on death row because he can afford good lawyers and he's the exception. So what Chapman says, you know, maybe we should rethink the death penalty. And now we've got Boston. There were a few things that were released over the weekend, not too many yet because it's still unfolding. But one of the things I thought was fascinating is Judy Clark, who was the lead attorney on the Boston Marathon case. She said, when you have a tough choice and you have to choose between life and death, you always choose life. It's another thing you probably never thought you would hear a defense attorney saying, choose life. Again, the seamless garment of life, even though they don't realize they're endorsing it. In even cases of people that you wouldn't think would be worthy of the dignity of human life, people are saying, we have to choose life, we have to protect life. Professor Timothy Muldoon is the vice president for university and ministry at Boston College. They opened up the college right after the bombing and took all of the injured people in, and that's what the place they used for the triage. They asked him what he thought about the death penalty. This was before the sentence came in. And he said, no, we can't do it. Mercy is predicated on the fundamental asymmetry, which is kind of like a mathematical equation. And that asymmetry is this: God's mercy toward us is greater than we deserve, and we are called to practice that toward one another. And that's the man that was knee-deep in the bombings, and that's his feeling toward the whole thing. He said the death penalty in this case, can't do it. Wall Street Journal, on the other hand, wants to argue that this does fit the case of extreme gravity that the Catechism talks about. They see it as an act of war. They see it as such a massive crime against society. They say that even a society as tolerant as ours still believes that some acts deserve the ultimate penalty. So again, we'll have this argument for a while. We'll have to see how it shakes out. But I will tell you this, and I will close with this. This was issued originally by Pope John Paul II. Later, Pope Benedict, when he first got elected Pope, reaffirmed it. And then Francis also reaffirmed it right after he got elected. The statement, plain and simple, is this: opposition to the death penalty is a part of the Church's defense of the dignity of life. Opposition to the death penalty is part of the Church's defense of the dignity of life. Even in a case like mine, where my friend was so viciously targeted and killed, it is a part of the Church's defense on the dignity of life.
Going from tall to short. My name is, I'm Dr. Cynthia Jones-Nosacek. I'm married to the deacon, by the way. I am a family physician. I have been in practice for over 30 years, and I do just about a little bit of everything. I deliver babies, I take care of babies, and mom, and dad, and grandma, and grandpa. I've done hospice work, nursing homes. So when we look at sort of this, womb to tomb, abortion and end of life, I will admit I have dealt with pretty much all of it. But I've been assigned the task of talking about end of life issues. And the first thing we need to remember is as Catholics, that God alone is the Lord of life from beginning to its end, from fertilization to natural death. We believe that life is sacred. We have been made in God's image and likeness. Therefore, we are responsible for our own lives before God. But we're stewards, we're not owners of this life. God has given us the gift, and we are there to use it for His work. Lives that have been diminished by illness or handicapped deserve special treatment to help them to live as normal a life as possible. Often when people are suddenly disabled, they find that after a time of adjustment, they actually are happier and more satisfied than the so-called normal people. We call that the disability paradox. And therefore, we are taught that we should not prefer those strong over the weak. What we call the cult of the body, where health and strength are worshipped in and of itself. What I tell my patients is that, my job as their physician is to help them to live as full life as possible with the time that has been given. And I think that's probably the best way of summing this all up. But our lives are also social. We are not unto ourselves. We are part of the body of Christ, which means we are all interconnected. And think of it, when you've lost somebody who was close to you, someone has died. It's almost like someone cut your arm off. We're missing something. And that's what a death happens. One of the things I like to read is, that I've heard about it's from the Jewish mystical text called the Kabbalah. And they have a saying that says that when you destroy a life, you destroy the universe. Therefore, we need to live in solidarity. Not to see life which would require greater acceptance, love, and care being considered useless or held to be an intolerable burden, and is therefore to be rejected one way or another. This is from St. John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae. We should show compassion, and the root of compassion is to suffer with. The Gospels state 5 times that Jesus was moved with compassion. And who can forget the compassion of the Father, not only for the prodigal son, but for the other son as well? He went out to them. You know, Jesus on the road to Emmaus, his 2 disciples were going the wrong way. He walked with them as they were on that journey, yet at the same time taught them, talked to them, helped them, converted them, so that when they saw him in the breaking of the bread, they turned around and came right back. Caring for the sick falls under the corporal works of mercy. As Blessed Mother Teresa says, I see Jesus in every human being. I say to myself, this is sick Jesus. I must wash him and tend to him. I serve because I love Jesus. We also believe that suffering endured, as St. Paul would say, in my flesh, I complete what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body. So when we unite our sufferings with Christ's passion, suffering becomes consecrated. It becomes configured. We actually believe as Catholics, unlike some other Catholic traditions, is that this helps to participate in Jesus' saving work. It's kind of like the song, the servant song. Will you let me be my servant? Be your servant. Let me be as Christ to you. Pray that I may have the strength to let you be my servant too. So what happens, what do we do when life happens? After all, we plan. Planning's not all bad. If I didn't plan for this talk, you certainly would get not as good a talk as I hope you're getting today. But how do we respond when life doesn't happen as we planned? Now, if you look at the world, planning has become now the need for control. Think of the Bridezilla show. It's all about her. The groom is sort of an appendage. Family, forget it. We control our fertility through contraception, and then when we lose that control, someone will turn to abortion. And in fact, women will choose abortion over adoption because they see that as a loss of control. Final example would be, of course, Brittany Maynard, that beautiful young woman who, when faced with death and the loss of control, felt the need to gain that control back by taking her own life. And by the way, she did take it 7 months after she was given 6 months to live. The Catholic response, therefore, becomes that we should trust in the Lord. We accept the inevitability of death. We don't impede death. We consider death to be our last Passover and the end of the sacramental life. And so the church, so that as we try to decide what am I going to do as life happens to me, when I become ill, if I become disabled, it says that when we decide whether or not to accept treatment, we should use what they can call ordinary and proportionate means to preserve life. That means that the treatment should have a reasonable hope of benefit, a reasonable hope of prolonging life, does not impose excessive burden or expense to the family or society, and does not cause significant physical discomfort. This also includes things like food and water, when needed, such as a feeding tube when you're no longer able to swallow. Trying to decide what is reasonable obviously involves a discussion with the patient, with the physician, with the family. My best example is I had a patient who had a health condition that caused very severe anemia. She was a Jehovah's Witness, so of course didn't want to get blood. And I talked to her about it, and she was adamant, and I said, fine, we'll treat you, according to your beliefs. As time went on and she was sicker, her husband, who was not a Jehovah's Witness, I think finally talked her into it, and she decided that she would get the blood transfusions. So we did it, and it involved usually a day because we were giving her several units over a period of time. But it did help her to feel better for a few months. Unfortunately, because she had waited, she had developed problems with her heart and with her kidneys. And as time went on, the treatments became less and less effective. Where before she was doing well for 3 months, now it was 2 months, and then it was a month, and then, she wasn't feeling much better at all. And that was the time that we decided that this was no longer reasonable and proportionate. It was unreasonable and disproportionate, and therefore we stopped that treatment. But planning for the end of life is not necessarily a bad thing. We need to know, people need to know where we're coming from if we're unable to make those decisions for ourselves. There are some things, though, that I would not recommend. The first is what we call the Declaration to Physicians, or the Living Will. What it is an attempt to try to plan now, especially now when you're maybe feeling healthy and well, for something that may not happen for many years from now. And just like this woman who needed the blood transfusion, maybe it's going to help and maybe it's not going to help. But you can't say now what's going to happen then. It involves check boxes. So again, this is what I want, this isn't what I want. When I was doing nursing home work, people would check off boxes saying, I don't want a feeding tube. And there would come a time when perhaps they were weakened by an illness, but had a long-term good prognosis. And I said, well, this has made them pretty weak, but if we give them some food, they could get stronger and then start eating on their own again. And do you think that that's what your mother wanted? And when I thought about it, a lot of times they would say, well, yeah, that's not what they meant. They thought when you get a feeding tube, you get it forever. My mother's a great example of it. My mother's actually a member of the Hemlock Society, or what they now call Compassion and Choices, or was. She's unfortunately deceased. When she went into the hospital during her final illness, she had those check boxes, and one of them was she didn't want to be on a ventilator. And she had an infection, and it had affected her ability to breathe, and we were seriously considering whether or not she'd have to go on a ventilator. And I said, and obviously I'm not her power of attorney for health care, but I said to her, I said, Mom, the doctors say you're having trouble breathing, we may get to the point where we have to put you on a ventilator, but your lungs underlying are pretty healthy. And there's a good chance that as you recover, your lungs will get healthy again and we'll be able to take you off the ventilator. Well, that's not what she meant when she did that checkbox. She thought what it meant when she was checking it off was that if I couldn't get off the ventilator, if something happens to me and I have to be ventilator dependent, I don't want to be on a ventilator. Fortunately, we never got to that point, but I've seen that time again. And that's why, limiting yourself in such a way can cause problems, and sometimes the very thing that you didn't want to happen. Within the state now, we also have a program called Honoring Choices. Honoring Choices is sponsored by the Wisconsin Medical Society, but what it does is it emphasizes quality of life and life worth living, which means, some people's lives are more worth living than other people's lives are worth living. It emphasizes complications such as tube feedings and CPR. So, for example, they train people, and if they say, well, if you stop breathing or heart stops, do you want CPR? And if you say yes, their next question is, well, do you want your ribs broken? Well, the fact is that not everybody who has CPR gets their ribs broken, but they make that implication that, gee, that's going to happen to you, and do you want to live that way? I think for me as a physician, the scariest part for me is that they use what they call facilitators. These are non-medical people who have, many of them have either limited or no medical background. that have been given a script, received training, and now they're going to help people make these complicated medical decisions that even I struggle with. Therefore, it circumvents my role as a physician to talk to patients, to explain to them what we call informed consent. These are your risks, these are your benefits. What do you want to do at this moment? Again, like my mom, what you decide to do at one moment may not be what you decide to do at the next moment. I think the worst one, and unfortunately not too much in this stage, is another document, we call it POLST. Providers' Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. It's a preset form, can override the decision of a guardian. The patient's signature is actually optional. So so when you're handed this form, all that may be, the only signature will be the facilitator that said, oh yes, honest, I talked to this person, this is honest, this is what they wanted. And then a physician, and then they hand it to a physician who just signs off on it, who never talked to the patient either. Therefore, there's no physician input in this decision process, and no conscience clause. It's if the patient says, I don't want this, and I don't feel that that's in their best, the best medical decision for them, I can't say, I won't do this. I have to find someone else that will do what I think is wrong. They call it a patient autonomy, but patient autonomy means that if I have somebody and they have diabetes and all they do is sit around and eat lemon meringue pie all day and lift nothing heavier than the TV remote, and I tell them, well, gee, you really should be exercising and you really should learn to eat healthy. You might even like some vegetables if you try them. And they say, I prefer my lemon meringue pie and my television shows. I can't physically, pick them up, take them to the gym, and make them exercise for an hour. However, the only two exceptions to that rule, patient then can't come to me and say, I know I've got a cold, but I really would like some penicillin. I know it's a virus, but I feel better if I got some penicillin. I can say, no, I'm sorry, that's not in your best interest, it's not good medical care, you cannot get your penicillin, at least not from me. And nor do I have to find someone else then that will give them their penicillin. But if a patient wants to have an abortion, there are those who say, I have to to find someone who will do that for them. Or, in the states where they have physician-assisted suicide, you have to find someone who will do it for you. Physician-assisted suicide is perhaps the I think the worst thing that's happened to medicine since the Hippocratic Oath. They call it death with dignity, as if a natural death is undignified. It's the ultimate in control. They always say, well, people are in pain and we've got to treat their pain, and yes, we can treat their pain. In fact, that's not why people choose physician-assisted suicide. According to the Oregon statistics from 2013, which are the last year we have, the most common reason, and you can check off multiple reasons, so that's why this doesn't add up to 100%. 93% cited loss of autonomy. 89% cited loss of control. 73% cited loss of dignity. Second to the last was lack of pain control or the fear that it was going to happen. So it wasn't that their pain wasn't under control, they just worried that maybe someday I'll have pain and it won't be under control. Suicide contradicts the natural inclination to preserve one's life and is contrary to just love of self. It voluntarily breaks the ties that bind us together. It offends the love of neighbor. But when you combine this with physician-assisted suicide, not only is the person saying, my life isn't worth it. These 6 months, which is what you're supposed to have, which obviously doesn't doesn't always work. But, you know, they're saying these 6 lives are not worth it. And I just want to end it all. Not only are they saying that, but your friends, your relatives, your spouse, they're saying, yeah, you know, you're right. You should die. And even worse, society, in the name of the physician, is saying, you know, you're right. Your life doesn't mean anything. Take these pills and everything will be okay. As an alternative, what I would recommend is what we call the power of attorney for healthcare. What it is a document listing a person who you trust to make those decisions when the time occurs when you can't make that decision. Along with it, our bishops have what we call have an addendum, and I have copies of a power of attorney for healthcare, but more important, the Catholic addendum. They're actually nice enough to have a non-Catholic addendum, which is pretty much the same as the Catholic addendum, and it just takes out the part about calling a priest. It's a guideline. It's not like the declarations to physicians say, this is what I want and this is not what I want. It says, when you decide how you are going to treat me, when I cannot make those decisions for myself, it should be proportionate. You know, we should do feeding tubes, you know, unless it becomes a burden to me. You know, for example, people in the end stages of cancers, feeding them actually makes them suffer more than not feeding them. We call it feeding the tumor. You know, and it gives people an idea. This is where I'm coming from. This is how I want you to make decisions for my life. So in the end, what we teach is that life is good. Man's life comes from God. It is His gift, His image and imprint, a sharing of His breath of life. God, therefore, is the sole Lord of this life. Man cannot do with it as he wills. And that, again, is from St. John Paul II, Evangelium Vitae. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, Gary, and Cindy, for being here and speaking with us and sharing your experience, your wisdom, and your teaching. We do have a few minutes. If anybody has any questions for the 3 of them, they're obviously still here. Anybody has any questions they'd like to ask of these folks before we close today?
Well, whatever the law happens to be, civil law, it's a great irony. Now, I'm speaking for my own living within the church for my 64 years, you know, whether good or bad. Hopefully better. Yeah. The point is, how can you live in the church and want to be exiting society, growing older, and still not having heard that our responsibility, as Pope Francis talks about in his letter on the death penalty, so many people don't have the concept we are to show mercy. And that means it was said so well by an 8th grade girl in England. I am here in this school, in this particular parochial school, because I am called to do the greatest good that God gives me to other people. And people here, they'll go to church for years and years and years and have no concept of that. And I think it speaks both to the death penalty, it speaks to the life issue, it speaks to the end of life issues as well. People have this concept of worship. God doesn't really. Worship serves man because it enables him to be merciful to other people. And the church has struggled for this for centuries. We're beginning within the latest papacies from John Paul and to have a clearer concept, and certainly with Pope Francis, it's really clearer, much clearer. But the whole concept of mercy is very foreign and alien to people who've gone to church for years. And anybody who has had the training in the parochial school, we had people memorize ideas, correct notions, The church's own past history has tried to impose clear thinking on people to the point of doing violence to life. And people bring this up to your issues, like the church has been one of the greatest persecutors of life with regard to falsely accusing people of whether being of witches or heretics or something like that, trying to impose. So I mean, in the last, 50, 100 years, with the modern papal popes, this here that we have, there's been a general movement toward the gospel, but we have a long history of great injustice within our own history. And I think it's going to be brought up, but I mean, I think we're called, and that's the individual conversion that each of us tries to participate in, to be merciful people as we live out our lives and our own calls. You know.
Yeah, it's a great point, and obviously, no institution, church included, has a unblemished record and has made faults and has made mistakes, and I hope that we continue to make that move towards a more merciful and more compassionate church and society. One of our speakers on Monday actually made the comment about the long arc of time tends towards justice, and hopefully we as Catholics are doing that same thing, that long arc towards mercy, towards compassion, towards dignity, and we can keep moving ourselves in that way in myriad ways and keep improving that. So it's a good point, and hopefully we can stay on that path.
I think that what he was just talking about is true, that what people don't understand life issues. And it would be really nice if you were taking this, maybe if you could put on the Archdiocese website to share with other people or share with other churches because they gave really good, concise talks on each of these different things. It would be nice to share it with more people.
That's our plan, is to keep things out. We've got some opportunity to share these through our parish websites, and obviously if Archdiocese decides to use them, then that's what we get this about through the Catholic Herald and trying to share this information and spread this word. And that actually, well, I won't get into that, but yes, I think that's a great idea, and hopefully we can spread the word about this and really be. That's my hope, is to do these kind of talks, gives people a good primer and introduction to these ideas that maybe they don't know about or they haven't been taught. It can teach them how we can be a more merciful and more compassionate, more dignified church. So it's a good idea.
One of the points that people who are in favor of the death penalty made is that this is a new thing that John Paul invented and then was emphasized by Benedict and Francis, and contrary to Catholic teaching. But as Francis says in this letter, it goes all the way back to St. Ambrose, way, way, way back, where Ambrose said God didn't want to even punish Cain with homicide. He wants the sinner to repent more than he wants him to die. So going way back to the days of St. Ambrose, the church has said no to the death penalty.
Good point, and that's precisely why I wanted you all to talk about this and show that these ideas, this idea of the sanctity of life, all life, is not a new idea. It's not something that just came along, but it's something that we have, as a faithful people, have believed in for the history, and even beyond even the history of Christianity, but respect for life back to our creation. So, good point, Gary. Thank you.
I want to thank Cynthia. The concept of, we brought up the subject of loss of control, and we've gotten recently Richard Rohr, Franciscan, talks a lot about ego, and that's what he's getting at, is this concept that we as human beings get all hung up on our ego, about what we want or how we think it ought to be or whatever. And yet that's sort of an example of us as humans wanting to control our own death. And that's not always possible. Life happens, as you say. It's a very good concept.
Thank you.
Yes, Sister Sue?
I have a question for Dan. You said that African Americans are targeted by the abortion industry.
And minorities.
Do you have any numbers on that? I was kind of surprised when you said that, because African American people love their children. And having children is a sign of
Sure.
dignity.
A better question posed to Planned Parenthood, I would suppose, but those are the facts. 79% of their facilities are in minority neighborhoods.
Have you, and I actually had that same question, or kind of the same question is, have you, I'm sure people have posed that question to them, has there ever been a response as to why that may be their practice of placing facilities or their clinics or whatever they're called in those areas?
I would never be a good spokesman for Planned Parenthood, but I would suppose
Not that I'm asking you to be.
a lot of them are in, bigger cities where there is maybe a bigger concentration of minorities. But the example that I illustrated today in Walworth County with Planned Parenthood moving from Lake Geneva to Delavan, they followed the Hispanics. The Hispanics were in Lake Geneva. If you look at the demographics from the census from 2000 to 2010, you can see that they moved to Delavan from Lake Geneva. Not en masse or completely, but definitely a big trend there, and it does show it illustrates their targeting of minorities.
One of the things too with Planned Parenthood, it was founded by Margaret Sanger, and she is very well known as a eugenicist who wanted to create pure races. And she specifically, before Planned Parenthood, was targeting what she referred to as Negroes, Mexicans, Indians, and so it's kind of in their DNA, It's in the origin. In fact, before the war started, she actually had Hitler's chief of eugenics as a guest editorialist in some of her newspapers.
And
Birds of a feather.
yeah, Michael.
I guess I had actually more of a statement / question, I guess, or whatever. I was born and raised Catholic, but I've been away for quite a long time. Very recently, I decided to come back to the church. And so over the last, I guess that's one reason why I started coming to these talks, to the talks that have been put together, is to immerse myself back into the faith and the thought processes that go along with it. And so, I mean, if you guys maybe have a few minutes after we're finished here, I would like to, maybe have a little dialogue. I do have questions and concerns, and just a little, maybe you might be able to point me into some additional information I might be able to read or online or whatever, just so I can have a more. I mean, this was great. Don't get me wrong, but it's these are pretty intense topics, and someone such as myself, who, of course, I want to be true to the faith. I want to make sure that I understand it in opposition to some of the things that I've learned over the past many years. If that makes sense.
I think Andrew's whole point to doing these series is that this is kind of the diving board.
Yeah,
It's not supposed to define, be the end all.
Yeah.
You're supposed to go home now and do something with it.
Exactly. So, I mean, obviously, three of you have some wealth of knowledge of this and might be able to, so I'm not, might be able to give me a little bit of a direction, point me in the right direction, I guess.
I can't speak for the three of you, knowing you as I do at various levels. I'm sure you'd all be happy to share resources. And like I said, some of the things are our printouts, but we also talked about a few things that we don't have here that we can send out as far as resources. So if anyone has their email address on there, if we have some other resources that we can talk about or they get asked about, that we can send out to people as well, so that we can share more information, more materials to read and get more familiar with these topics.
Yeah, and learning is good. I think, all of us, as you grow up, you start hearing things, and, and even some things on church doctrine where people will say, oh, well, it's because, the Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. He's never been a woman, or he's never done this, or he, or the, whatever, or, and then for me, it was going back to some of the original texts and the writings, or even the catechism. And, and it's not just saying, the church says this. Yeah, you're right, the church does say this. But if you start reading, then you find out this is why the church says this. Now, you can disagree with the why, but you can't say, well, the Pope, can't talk about this topic because, for whatever because it's politics, and the church shouldn't get in politics. But but then you read, social justice, and life is politics, and the church has every right to say, this is what we believe, this is what we're for, and this particular law doesn't follow our convictions.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what I was saying.
And that actually brings, unless there are other questions, I want to close this, but I want to say one thing, and you led very well into the last thing I want to say, and that is, I've had some folks address to me why this particular topic was one of our topics in our month for human dignity, or one of our social justice topics. And because a lot of folks, these topics at beginning and end of life are very personal choices, and are very intense topics, and they don't necessarily see them falling under this realm of social justice. We talk about issues of poverty and racism and environment and so on and so on. And in fact, this idea of seamless garment, we talk about that from the moment of conception to the moment of last natural breath. We have dignity in life, the whole spectrum. And so these issues bookend the respect for life that we have for all the other issues that come up. And so these are fundamental issues that come in to play when talking about social justice and talking about human dignity, that we have to respect life in all forms, in all places, and regardless of anything. You are at conception given dignity from God, and you have that dignity no matter what you do, no matter how you behave, no matter what you say, what you look like, anything like that, until your last natural breath. And so these issues are very much a part of social justice and a part of respecting human dignity for everyone. And so so it's hard to imagine having social justice and human concerns, or whatever you call it, without these being a part of it. And so I was very grateful to have Dan and Gary and Cynthia agree to talk on these, and glad this will be a part of our conversation during this month, and hope that their talks spark continued education and continued research and learning and prayer as we strive, again, in all ways, to be respectful of life and respect dignity for all folks. So again, I thank you three very much for coming and sharing your wisdom and your information with us. And I thank all of you for coming and spending about an hour and a half of your time here with us on a Sunday afternoon. I pray that you have a good rest of your Sunday, and we do have, like I said, 3 more talks coming up, one this Wednesday, and then 2 more the following week. The whole list is back there on the paper. If you don't have it, grab one, and hope to see you in some of our future talks. So thanks for being here, and have a great rest of your Sunday.